For years, we've been told free trade is the key to prosperity, until Trump flipped the script, launching a trade war that didn't just hit China but cost Americans billions. But here's the twist. Tariffs used to work. They built the U.S. into an industrial giant. So why did they once fuel growth, but now seem to backfire? Are they just a hidden tax, or could they still be a game changer? Tariffs have made a big comeback in economic debates, especially since Donald Trump turned them into both a bargaining chip and a supposed fix for America's trade problems. His approach, rooted in economic nationalism, harks back to the 19th century, a time when tariffs dominated U.S. policy, supposedly keeping income taxes at zero while shielding domestic industries. If they worked before, could they work again? It's an intriguing question, especially given the idea that tariffs might create enough fiscal breathing room to cut taxes while reviving the industrial heartland. Even die-hard free market economists admit that tariffs can make sense in certain cases. That's why fast-growing economies like India, Brazil, and of course China still rely on them. But the global economy has evolved dramatically since the U.S. last used tariffs on this scale. Today, American consumers are used to cheap goods from complex international supply chains that rely on low trade barriers. Slapping tariffs on imports would disrupt this system, forcing companies to raise prices just to stay afloat, essentially turning tariffs into a stealth tax on consumers. Still, the potential boost to manufacturing jobs and national security could justify some economic trade-offs. Of course, the discussion around tariffs is deeply politicized, but at the core, they're just a tool, neither inherently good nor bad. Think of them like a wrench, great for tightening bolts, but not exactly ideal for brain surgery. Blanket statements about tariffs tend to be oversimplified because their impact varies widely depending on the market. That's why a nuanced approach is more important than ever. So, let's break it down. How do tariffs actually work? What can chickens and washing machines teach us about them? And most importantly, could tariffs be worth it even if they come with an economic cost? By the time Europe was cranking out steel, textiles, and high-precision machinery like a well-oiled machine, the U.S. was struggling to keep up. Its industries were still in their infancy, lacking capital, infrastructure, and a skilled workforce to match Europe's production dominance. Competing on a level playing field was out of the question. So the U.S. tilted the scales. Tariffs jacked up the price of European imports, nudging entrepreneurs to start manufacturing domestically instead. This strategy ramped up throughout the late 19th century, with tariffs climbing past 40% on key goods. The result? A manufacturing boom. Tariffs didn't just protect U.S. industries, they paid the bills. In fact, they were so lucrative that nearly all government revenue came from them, making income tax unnecessary until the early 1900s. But like any economic weapon, tariffs had unintended casualties. While factories flourished in the North, the agrarian South took a hit. Retaliatory tariffs from Europe made it harder to export Southern staples like cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, cutting off a major income stream. The infamous Morrill Tariff only made matters worse, deepening tensions between North and South as the country hurtled toward the Civil War. So, if today's tariff debates feel heated, just remember, they were quite literally part of what tore the country in two. But history has a way of flipping the script. By the time World War II ended, the U.S. was no longer the scrappy underdog. It was the economic heavyweight. With its industries now global powerhouses and much of the world still in ruins, America pivoted from protectionism to promoting free trade. As technology shrank the world, trade became more efficient, and nations leaned into specialization. By 1995, free trade was the undisputed champion, cemented by the rise of the World Trade Organization. Supply chains sprawled across continents, and it became normal for a single product to have parts sourced from a dozen different countries. Free trade seemed unstoppable until 2018 when the U.S., once its biggest cheerleader, suddenly turned the tables and slapped tariffs on China. That's when we got a rare modern experiment on how tariffs play out in real time. And the case study, washing machines. A Federal Reserve analysis found that when tariffs were placed on imported washers, retailers wasted no time passing those costs on to customers. Domestic manufacturers, seeing an opportunity, also hiked their prices, even though they weren't paying the tariff. And the ripple effects didn't stop there. Dryers, completely untaxed, also became more expensive simply because they were often bought alongside washers. The kicker? the total price increase for consumers actually exceeded the tariff itself. Reports from top economic journals confirmed it. Tariffs didn't just hit foreign manufacturers, they squeezed everyday Americans at the checkout counter. At the end of the day, tariffs function as a roundabout way to tax consumers, without ever calling it a tax. And the 2018 to 2019 tariffs? They were a masterclass in this tactic. In total, they effectively placed an $80 billion tax burden on Americans, making it one of the largest tax hikes in modern history. That much is well understood. But tariffs could still be justified if the jobs they create outweigh the cost to consumers. So, let's crunch the numbers. The washing machine tariffs alone cost American consumers $1.5 billion per year, yet the government only raked in an extra $82 million annually in revenue. They did help create 1,800 new U.S. manufacturing jobs, but at a jaw-dropping cost of $815,000 per job per year. That's a wildly inefficient way to boost employment. If the goal was job creation, the government could have funded those positions directly at a fraction of the price. But here's where things get worse. Tariffs don't just affect consumers. Businesses, especially those that rely on imported materials, get hit too. Washing machines are a final product, so they don't tell the full story. But you know what does? Steel. In 2018, a 25% tariff on imported steel sent shockwaves through American industries. Suddenly, essential materials like steel plates, beams, rods, and pipes, lifeblood for construction, automotive, and machinery companies, became significantly more expensive. The result? Shrinking profit margins, layoffs, and higher costs that rippled across the economy. Sure, jobs in domestic steel manufacturing saw a slight boost, but for every hire in that sector, multiple jobs were lost elsewhere. The overall effect? A net decrease in U.S. manufacturing employment, proving that tariffs can accelerate industrial decline just as easily as they prevent it. And then there's the inevitable counterpunch. When the U.S. imposed tariffs, China responded in kind, slapping duties on American agricultural products. This instantly made U.S. exports pricier for Chinese buyers, slashing demand and cutting income for American farmers. To prevent mass layoffs in the agricultural sector, the U.S. government had to step in, shelling out $61 billion in subsidies between 2018 and 2020. That's nearly the entire $66 billion the government collected in tariffs on Chinese goods, meaning the net fiscal gain was almost wiped out. Essentially, the trade war turned into a high-stakes game of economic whack-a-mole, where every dollar gained from tariffs triggered another problem that required more government spending to fix. Now it's worth noting that most of these studies only measure the short-term effects of tariffs, and in the short run, they clearly increased costs for consumers and hurt key industries. But in the long run, things could play out differently. Given enough time, production factors naturally shift, potentially leading to increased domestic investment, job creation, and industrial growth. Whether that actually happens, or whether tariffs just end up being an expensive self-inflicted wound, is the trillion-dollar question. Luckily, we don't have to rely solely on recent data to understand tariffs. We have decades-old examples that show how they play out over time. Take the chicken tax, a 25% tariff slapped on imported light trucks in 1964. Since then, pickup trucks and SUVs have become the cash cows of the American auto industry, with Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis raking in massive profits. The tariff shielded domestic automakers from foreign competition at a time when outsourcing threatened American manufacturing. It even nudged global giants like Honda, Toyota, Nissan, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz to invest billions in U.S. factories, creating tens of thousands of jobs across the South from the 1980s onward. On paper, the tariff did exactly what it was supposed to do: protect domestic industry and attract long-term investment. But as with all tariffs, there was a catch. With only 3 major players dominating the U.S. truck and SUV market, competition dwindled. That meant less pressure to innovate, improve efficiency, or keep prices in check. And that's the real dilemma with tariffs. If they shield an industry too well, companies get complacent, and consumers end up paying the price. A well-designed tariff should create just enough protection to support domestic industry without stifling competition. The U.S. truck market, however, remains less competitive than it could be, with consumers footing the bill through higher prices and slower advancements in quality. Even when tariffs are carefully structured, companies often find loopholes to dodge them. Case in point, when Mercedes-Benz built its South Carolina factory in 2006, it looked like another win for the SUV tariff. But in reality, Mercedes was assembling its vans in Germany, taking them apart like an IKEA flat pack, and shipping the disassembled parts to the US for reassembly, completely sidestepping the 25% import duty. Over time, the plant evolved into a more legitimate manufacturing hub, but the workaround highlights the extreme lengths companies will go to in order to avoid tariffs. And some strategies are even more elusive. When the US hit China with tariffs in 2018, many manufacturers didn't move operations back to the US. They just relocated to Vietnam, Mexico, or other low-cost countries outside the tariff zone. Others exploited repackaging schemes, where goods were shipped to a third-party country, relabeled, and then imported into the US tariff-free. This highlights a key flaw. Companies often have multiple ways to bypass tariffs before they ever consider the most expensive option, actually bringing production back home. The success of a tariff depends on a web of factors, from the type of goods targeted to the specific countries involved, making it a complex and high-stakes economic gamble. The debate around tariffs has become a political battlefield, with sweeping generalizations drowning out the nuance, and that's a problem. Trump has frequently championed tariffs, but without clear details on what, where, and how they'd be applied, it's nearly impossible to predict their full impact. If he's considering a blanket tariff on all imports, then whatever industrial or fiscal benefits tariffs could offer would likely be erased by a toxic mix of skyrocketing production costs, inflated consumer prices, and inevitable retaliation from trade partners. The result? A short-term economic shock that could easily turn into long-term stagnation. So why did tariffs work so well in the 19th century but seem far riskier today? Simple. Back then, the world was different. Trade moved at a snail's pace, products were simpler, and American labor was cheap. Today, global supply chains are hyper-efficient, products are intricate, and domestic labor costs are high. Free trade has allowed manufacturers to specialize, tap into subsidized industries abroad, and take advantage of looser labor laws in developing economies, making production more cost-effective than ever. There's no easy way to turn back the clock. For many industries, reshoring production would be painfully expensive, if not outright impossible. Most companies would rather shift operations to another low-cost country to sidestep tariffs than bring manufacturing back to US soil. And for those that do absorb the tariff, they'd simply pass the extra cost onto consumers, effectively making tariffs little more than a wealth transfer from American shoppers to the government without delivering on their promise of job creation. That doesn't mean tariffs are useless, but they need to be deployed surgically, not indiscriminately. Slapping tariffs on everything, including goods that have never been made in the US and never will be, is a recipe for economic turmoil. Instead, tariffs should be introduced gradually, in a way that allows industries to adapt, much like Alexander Hamilton did in the early days of American economic policy. Otherwise, uncertainty alone can paralyze business investment and erode trust in the system. But here's where things get more complicated. There are cases where tariffs could be justified, even if they come with economic costs. As global tensions rise and the world becomes more politically fractured, reliance on foreign-made goods is increasingly seen as a strategic vulnerability. Some industries, like semiconductors, energy, electric vehicles, rare earth minerals, and food, are simply too critical to be left dependent on geopolitical rivals. If a major conflict or crisis were to erupt, cutting off trade with an adversary could cripple an unprepared economy, leaving it unable to sustain its population, industries, or military. At that point, tariffs aren't just about economics, they're about national security. And when push comes to shove, the tariff debate stops being a question of GDP growth and becomes a matter of geopolitical survival. So, are tariffs a smart economic strategy or just a hidden tax that hurts consumers? The truth is, it depends. History shows us they can work, but only if used strategically. Get them wrong and they backfire. Get them right and they can reshape entire industries. But what do you think? Are tariffs a necessary tool in today's economy, or are they just making everything more expensive? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the hidden forces shaping our economy.